Job chapter 1, I'm going to start reading in verse 6. It says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, and one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hand, and the substance, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord." I'm going to go ahead and stop there for right now. The book of Job is one that to us as Christians is kind of the opposite of the way that we like to think. Though we are not part of one of kind of this sort of, or the sort of church I'm going to mention, we all kind of like the whole health, wealth, and prosperity idea. You know, we wouldn't say that we're part of that church, but we all kind of like that idea that if I obey God, then everything will go my way, and doors will always open for me, and I'll be rich, and everything will be great. Except the book of Job goes completely against that. Amen. Because the Bible doesn't say that this came up because Job sinned. In fact, it shows us the opposite. This didn't happen because God was punishing Job. Job was living right. Job was doing as he should, and yet Satan comes to God, and God points him to Job. This points him to Job, saying that this man will do right no matter what, and God allows Satan access to attack Job. And we know what happens from there. In a matter of moments, if we had continued reading on in this chapter, in a matter of moments, Job loses his oxen, his asses, his sheep, his camels, his children, and his servants. And while maybe not physically, he also lost his wife and his friends in a very short amount of time. Job is going through a time that it would have been extremely easy to think, where is God? I mean, this is a situation where it would have been really easy to think God has abandoned me and left me here on my own. But I want us tonight to, as we go through this, notice that in it all, God hadn't left Job. My title tonight, just kind of for myself, is God in the Worst of Days. Because that's what Job is having. You know, we all sometimes have what we consider a bad day. And in those days, you know, you'll often hear phrases like, "Can this day get any worse?" Which always seems like a dumb thing to say to me, but, you know, why a person would ask that, because then it does. But I would guess that everyone in here has had that day that you could think, or that you could think of, where you thought, you know, this is the worst day ever, for whatever reason. You know, for some it may be a string of bad things that happened. For some it might be, you know, kids got sick, or a fight at home, a problem at work, at school, whatever. But a day that you thought, you know, this was the worst day ever, and you felt you were alone. Because somehow we get the mentality that when we go through something bad, that it's worse than anything that anyone has ever dealt with before. You know, we get that mentality that I'm going through this and no one understands my pain. No one has had it as bad as me before. No one is there for me. But I'm just going to take a step of faith here and say that no one has had a bad day that quite lives up to what Job just faced. You know, none of us have lost everything possible in one day. He literally lost everything except for his health in one day, and he lost that shortly thereafter. None of our bad days come close to that. You know, I've had some bad days, but nothing that compares. And yet through it, God was there, God was involved, and more than that, God was orchestrating it. I want to start out by pointing this out, and we'll kind of see this as we go through this, that if God was there for this day in Job's life, do you think He's there for your bad day? I have this evening 4 things that I want us to see God in the book of Job. The first thing I want to see is that God knew Job. Look at chapter 1, verse 6, 7, and 8. It says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. The Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil." When Satan comes to God and all of this started, God didn't have to think about it. There's no pause to think, well, who can I send Satan to? He immediately thought of Job, which in my mind tells me a few things. It tells me that he knew Job by name. There was a personal relationship between God and Job. He wasn't, just some guy over in the distance, who God said, you need someone to attack, go get that guy. No, he knew Job. There was a relationship there. It tells me that God knew what kind of man Job was. God knew that there was none like Job in the earth. And when you start to think about that statement, that's quite the statement, because Job didn't live in a time that he would have been considered the only godly man. In studying for this, I was doing some research, and I came across several articles that had an issue with that statement, because their argument was, well, Job lived in a time where there were other godly men. But it doesn't say that he was the only godly man. It says there were none like him. Well, that's quite a statement when you're living in a time with some other godly people. Narrowing down exactly when Job lived is extremely difficult. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly, but based off of some of the hints that we do see, we can figure out it was somewhere between the times of Noah and Moses. Well, in that time frame, you have men like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those were some godly men, but the Bible says there was none like Job. That's quite a statement. God knew this man. God knew that Job was a perfect and upright man. God knew that Job feared him. God knew that he eschewed evil, which simply means he hated evil. God knew what kind of man he was, but it also tells me that God knew what kind of reaction Job would have. He knew how Job would respond to Satan's attack. Growing up, my brother got picked on a lot, and for good reason, because people who like to pick on other people do it because they like a reaction. That's the only reason you pick on someone, is you want a reaction. They want you to get mad or upset or some sort of reaction, and I figured that out, so I wouldn't give them the reaction that they wanted, and people would leave me alone. And Bo knew that. He knew they only picked on him because he reacted, but I guess he couldn't help himself, so he reacted, and they just kept picking on him. But again, left me alone for the most part. The reason, they knew his reaction. That's what we have here. God knew the reaction, or what the reaction of Job would be, which just tells me something very important, that God had been paying attention to Job. God had been paying attention. The only way that you know someone by name and know what kind of person they are and know how they are going to react when something as terrible as this comes in their life, the only way you can know those things is if you're pretty familiar with that person. You don't learn those sorts of things about someone in casual conversation. You don't figure out, these kind of in-depth things about a man just in passing. God knew him before this. And as I study this, to me, it's a comforting thought to know that God knows me. Well, it's either very comforting or very convicting. Because God knows my name. God knows what kind of man I am. God knows my personality. God knows what I do and don't like. He knows me, which is either really good or really bad, depending on what He knows about me. God knows how you'll respond. When we have a trial upcoming, God already knows how you're going to react. He knows me. Number two, we can see God in this, then, that God was protecting. Look at chapter 1, verse 12. The Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. Skip down chapter 2, verse 6. Satan has now come back and is talking to God again. This is after the first attack, and Job still hasn't cursed God, and still hasn't sinned. Verse 6, the Lord said unto Satan, behold, he is thine, but save his life. God didn't say to Satan, did you consider Job, and just leave it at that. He did a few things to protect Job. He put restrictions on Satan. Satan wasn't given, just free rein to do whatever he wanted to do. God was handcuffing him a little, if you will. He allowed the attack to come, but within his restraints. Why? Because he was protecting Job. With my kids, I'm their dad, and I protect them. But I've figured out I can't protect my kids from everything. I wish I could, but I can't protect my kids from everything, especially as they get older. It's just not going to be possible to protect them from every bad thing that's going to come their way, the world's going to throw at them. So because of that, I will now occasionally let them deal with some things that are somewhat hard, to prepare them for the fact that life is hard, but the things I let them face are always within boundaries where I can step in if needed. Where I can allow it, but I can have some restrictions on it. I learned this from my parents. My parents strongly encouraged Bo and I to get jobs while we were living at home, while we were teenagers, and I don't know if it was their reasoning, but at least it seemed like it and made a lot of sense, is that we would face things in jobs that they knew were going to try to pull us from God. And they wanted us to face that while we were still under their influence and they could help control it. As opposed to many who make the mistake of, they protect their kids so much until they graduate and the kid is exposed to all of that and the parent has no control anymore. It's a form of protecting, and that's what God is doing. He allows this to come, but within His boundaries. God's protecting Job with the boundaries that He places, but He's also protecting Job by watching through his struggles. God didn't say, this is going to be hard for Job. I don't want to watch it. I'm going to turn the other way. He didn't say, this is going to be tough. I don't want to see Job have to go through these problems, so I'm just going to kind of ignore it. No, he watched. He stayed engaged. And I know that because later on in the book, when he and Job are talking, God rehearses back to Job what happened. Meaning he was there. Meaning he was watching the entire time. Things were bad, but God hadn't abandoned Job. He was still protecting him. He had allowed Satan inside that hedge of protection, but within his parameters, and he was keeping an eye out. Have you ever thought about the fact that even when you're under attack, God is still working to protect you? Even when you're facing an attack. You think about verses like 1 Corinthians 10:13. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape that ye may be able to bear it. Meaning that when going through, when you just think about this verse for a second, no temptation taken you, followed up by God is faithful, and we think, wait, what? Now, those can't go together, but it's meaning that when going through the temptation, God is controlling the temptation. He won't let you have more than you can handle, and He gives the way out. Even when going through that, God is still there. Even when going through that, He's still protecting. We can see God in the worst possible day in Job's life, in that He knew Job and in that He protected Job. Number 3, we can see God in this day, in that God came to Job. I'm going to have you turn to a couple of places. Turn over to Job chapter 38. Chapter 38, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said. Chapter 40, verse 1. Turn over just a little bit more. Chapter 40, verse 1. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said. Skip down to verse 3. Then Job answered the Lord and said. Verse 6. Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said. It goes on from there. Chapter 42, verse 1. Not 42, verse 1. I wrote down the wrong. One more place that that God answers Job again, that Job has gone through all of this trial, that he's now faced that he has lost everything. He's now past where his wife tells him, just curse God and die, so that, he'll strike you dead. He's past his supposed friends coming and, I guess they said they were comforting, but tearing him down. He's cried out to God, in essence, wanting answers, wanting to know why. He knows he hadn't done anything wrong. He knows that this can't be punishment. Why? And I'm not this evening really going to go into what God answers him, but what I want us to focus on very simply is that he cries out to God, and God answered. God didn't leave Job alone and in question and in despair. God came to him. And in that, he helped Job in a couple of ways. He helped Job by reminding Job who he is. Reminding Job who Job is. All of chapter 38 38 and 39 kind of goes into this, but look at 40 verse 3 and 5, kind of the end of it. He's just finished, God has just finished explaining to Job, reminding Job who he is, and here's Job's response. But then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay mine hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer, yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. Here's what God does. He reminds Job that Job is nothing. It's what we see in those 3 verses we just read in chapter 40, that Job is going, oh yeah, I have no right to question you. You know what? The thought of God reminding you that you're nothing doesn't sound real helpful. You've just gone through, Job has just gone through this terrible thing. He's just gone through the ringer, and God comes to him to help by reminding you that you're nothing. But that's a reminder that we all need. Because we all tend to think very highly of ourselves. We all tend to put ourselves kind of on a pedestal and start to think that we are something. And if God has blessed us at all, we tend to think we're this big thing. And every once in a while, we need to get knocked down a few pegs. So God reminds Job just how, I hate to put it this way, but just how insignificant Job is. And then he reminds Job of who he is, who God is. Chapter 40, verse 6 through 9. Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said, Gird up thy loins now like a man, and I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me, Wilt thou disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? Hast thou an arm like God, or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? And he goes on and on from there. He reminds Job of his power and of who he is, which is something that we very often tend to forget. We tend to overlook just how powerful God really is. We see our problems and we see how big they are. We see a trial that we're going through, and we see how big that trial is. We see all these other things going on, and we see how big they are, and somehow we miss how much bigger God is than our problem. And you know what I think the problem is? The problem is that what we are closest to looks the biggest. It's just like, if I hold my thumb up right now, I can't see Brother Jantz. So by that logic, my thumb is bigger than Brother Jantz, right? No, it's perceived that way because my thumb is closer than Brother Jantz. But if I walk closer to Brother Jantz, my thumb doesn't look that large anymore. And oftentimes we see our trials as bigger than God because we're closer to the problem than we are to God. And rather than looking at God, we're trying to look at God through my problem. But the solution is pretty simple. Get closer to God. If we grow closer to Him, then you'll see that the problem, like my thumb, isn't that big after all. It's what God is doing for Job. He's reminding him that your problem may look big, but remember just how big I am. He came to Job. He reminded Job of who he is, and he reminded Job of who God is. And it's again a comforting thought to know that when I am in, like Job, the worst day imaginable, God comes to me, He hears my prayer, and better yet, He answers it. We can see God all through this, that God knew Job and God was protecting Job. God came to Job. And then lastly tonight, I want to see God rewarded Job. Turn over to chapter 42. I'm going to read just a couple of verses here. 42, I'm going to start reading in verse 12. So the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning. For he had 14,000 sheep and 6,000 camels and 1,000 yoke of oxen and 1,000 she-asses. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first Jemima, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third. When I wrote this, that I was going to read this, I forgot that there's names in here. And in all that land there was no women found so fair as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them inheritance among their brethren. After this lived Job 140 years, and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. So Job died, being old and full of days. Job has gone through all of this, and through it all he stayed faithful. Through it all he never turns from God. Through it all God was with him, and in the end God rewarded him. If you do the math, it works out to that God gave Job double. He blessed him. Now follow me on this. We should never follow God because if I do, He'll bless me. We should never do that. I should never give money to the church simply because I know the Bible says if I give, He'll give me tenfold, and so He's going to, multiply my money. We should never follow Him simply for the reason that I want Him to bless my life. But at the same point, it's good to know that God will supply my needs. That if I stay faithful to Him, it doesn't go unnoticed. And that might not mean that I get rich here on earth. It may not mean that I surrender my life to God and He gives me double what I had before, but it does mean that God will take care of me. All through this ordeal that Job faced, we can see evidence over and over that God was there right beside Job through it all, which tells me that I can know no matter what I am facing in life, God's there. That no matter what I'm facing in life, He knows me. He's protecting me. He'll come to me, and I'll be better for it when it's through. As I prepared this message, I thought of the song, Because He Lives. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future, and life is worth the living because He lives. The song goes on and says, I can face uncertain days because He lives. Bad days, uncertain days are going to come. Unfortunately, life can't be all sunshine and lollipops. I wish it was, but it's not. Bad days come. But they aren't so bad when we remember that God's there. When I stop trying to see God through my problem and just step closer to God, those bad days don't seem so bad anymore. The end of Job's life, that's what Job figures out, is those trials I went through are nothing when I remember who my God is. Let's pray.